The hushed mockery had been a slow burn, a prelude to the waiter's quiet storm. I fed you when you were hungry. You don't remember me, do you? Daniel's voice, though level, vibrated with the suppressed ache of years. The clatter of silverware ceased. The murmur of conversations died. Only the sax solo from the jazz band in the corner dared to fill the sudden void. A man in a meticulously tailored gray suit, a smirk already etched on his face, looked up, puzzled. Should I? He scoffed, a ripple of laughter echoing from his companions. Daniel stood firm, the weight of the serving tray, nicknamed Tray by the kitchen staff, suddenly amplified in his trembling hands. The aroma of sizzling steak and expensive red wine hung heavy in the air, but a bitter taste coated his tongue. He'd served countless men like this, men whose voices boomed, whose tips were meager, whose eyes never truly met his own. But tonight, something felt different, a shift deep within him, a dam about to burst, or perhaps, awaken. Just moments ago they'd been relentless. Boy, they'd called him, snapping their fingers as if summoning a relic from a bygone era. One of them, fueled by bravado and bourbon, had tossed a linen napkin at his feet, erupting in laughter as Daniel bent to retrieve it. The sound still reverberated in his mind, a stinging echo. But now, as he faced them, a new light flickered in his eyes, not anger, not fear, but a resolute truth. He drew a slow, steadying breath, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. You used to come to St. Mary's shelter, about 12 years ago. You were hungry, sir. I was the one who gave you food that night. The smirk evaporated from the man's face, replaced by a flicker of unease. His friends fell silent, their earlier amusement replaced by a palpable discomfort. A glass clinked softly against a table, the sound amplified in the stillness. Daniel's chest tightened, the words unplanned, erupting like a long overdue storm. Beneath his composure lay a tapestry woven with threads of hunger, loss, and the relentless struggle for survival experiences these men couldn't fathom. Maria, a seasoned waitress who'd seen it all, froze in her tracks, her eyes wide with disbelief. She'd never witnessed Daniel exude such raw, unadulterated life. There was something in his voice, a resonance that could make even the most hardened heart tremble. And that was the genesis. The night everything shifted on its axis. A few seconds stretched into an eternity, silence reigning supreme. The restaurant, once a symphony of clatter and chatter, held its breath, as if time itself paused to listen. The man in the gray suit stared at Daniel, his mouth slightly agape, caught off guard. His companions exchanged furtive glances, feigning interest in their phones, their eyes betraying their shock. Daniel stood tall, tray now steady in his grip. The confidence radiating from him wasn't arrogance, but profound dignity. He was no longer just a waiter. He was a man forcing another to confront a forgotten truth. I don't know what you're talking about, the man stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. He averted his gaze, then quickly looked back, searching Daniel's face for a spark of recognition, or perhaps a hint of deception. You came to St. Mary's shelter in 2013, Daniel reiterated softly. It was winter. You had no coat, no shoes. I was working in the kitchen then, helping serve the homeless. You were shivering. You cried when I handed you a bowl of soup. You said you hadn't eaten in 3 days. A flicker of recognition danced across the man's face, a fleeting glimpse of the past. His friends remained frozen, their earlier arrogance now replaced by stunned silence. The one closest to him whispered, his voice barely audible, "Wait, John, is that true?" John, the man in the gray suit, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I don't remember, he mumbled weakly, his denial unconvincing. His hand trembled as he reached for his glass, seeking solace in the amber liquid. Daniel didn't smile, didn't seek retribution. He craved understanding, a flicker of acknowledgement. You told me that night you'd never forget the people who helped you, Daniel continued, his voice laced with quiet sadness. You said one day when life got better you'd be kind, too. John averted his gaze, a crimson tide of shame washing over his face. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with unspoken words. His earlier laughter now felt like a toxic residue, a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. Maria, her voice barely a whisper, asked, "You okay, Daniel?" He offered a slight nod, but a deep ache resonated within him. He hadn't sought to humiliate anyone, only to remind them that kindness carried no price tag, and that those we looked down upon might have been the very ones who once extended a hand to help us rise. Daniel silently collected the empty plates from their table and retreated, every eye in the restaurant fixed upon him, the earlier mirth extinguished. Stepping back into the cacophony of the kitchen, the sizzle of pans and clatter of dishes seemed to amplify the silence that clung to him. Maria intercepted him, her voice hushed. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "They're just drunk men. They'll forget by tomorrow." Daniel met her gaze, his eyes carrying a weight of weariness. "That's the problem, Maria," he said softly. "They always forget. People like them always do." He placed the tray down, his hands still trembling subtly. For years, he'd learned to suppress his emotions, to swallow the words that burned within. But tonight, something within him had snapped, not from anger, but from a deep-seated need for truth. As he began washing dishes, a torrent of memories flooded back. He was 20 then, sleeping on park benches, tirelessly searching for jobs that always led to dead ends. His mother had passed away, his father a distant memory. He recalled standing in the desolate line outside St. Mary's shelter, shivering with cold and gnawing hunger, when Sister Elaine, a beacon of compassion, handed him a steaming bowl of soup and whispered, "Help others when you stand again, son." That moment had been transformative, imbuing his life with purpose. He dedicated 2 years to volunteering at the shelter, scrubbing floors, preparing meals, feeding the lost souls who mirrored his own past. It was there he encountered John, the man from the restaurant. Back then, John was a broken spirit, offering whispered thanks between tears as he consumed the food Daniel provided. Daniel never forgot his face, not out of pity, but out of empathy, recognizing a shared vulnerability. And tonight, when that same man mocked him, the insult resonated with a pain that surpassed any personal slight. He dried his hands, gazing at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. His face appeared weary yet resolute. "I didn't do it to shame him," he murmured to himself. "I just wanted him to remember." Through the kitchen door, he could still sense the weight of countless eyes upon him, a silent judgment. Something told him the night was far from over. John remained rooted to his chair long after Daniel's departure, his hands resting on the pristine white tablecloth, yet unable to quell their tremor. The laughter that had permeated the room earlier now felt like a phantom echo from a distant, unrecognizable life. He could still hear Daniel's calm, unwavering voice resonating in his mind. "You were hungry, and I fed you." For the first time in years, John felt diminished, insignificant. His friends, sensing his distress, attempted to lighten the mood with awkward jokes, but their efforts fell flat, hanging in the air like lead balloons. "Come on, man," one of them said softly. "He's just some waiter. Forget about it." But John couldn't dismiss it because deep within he remembered. That harsh winter night had never truly faded from his memory. He had been unemployed, homeless, consumed by despair. He'd lost his company after a series of disastrous investments and endured months of living out of his car, his world crumbling around him. The night he stumbled upon St. Mary's shelter, he had been on the precipice of giving up. He remembered the young man, his face etched with kindness, who had handed him a bowl of soup and a sandwich, his smile so genuine it had cracked through his hardened exterior. That man had been Daniel. Now that same man stood before him, serving his table, and John had subjected him to mockery. He pressed his hands against his face, the weight of his shame crushing him. How did I become this person? He wondered, his mind reeling. The money, the tailored suits, the exclusive restaurants, they had blinded him. making him forget the gnawing hunger, the crippling fear, and the countless acts of kindness that had paved his way back to prosperity. John rose silently, disregarding the confused expressions of his companions. "I'll be right back," he said, his voice trembling slightly, as he made his way toward the kitchen doors. He pushed through them and found Daniel meticulously cleaning a counter, his shoulders slightly slumped. "Daniel," John said, his voice low and filled with remorse. Daniel turned, startled by the sound of his name. "I remember now," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It was me. You saved me that night. I was lost. And you fed me." Daniel studied him, his gaze unwavering, his expression soft yet cautious. "I didn't save you, sir," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human." John nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "For the first time in years," he said, his voice cracking, "I feel human again." John lingered in the kitchen doorway, the sounds of sizzling pans and clattering dishes a dissonant soundtrack to his burgeoning guilt. Daniel turned back to the sink, resuming his task with exaggerated focus, pretending to scrub a plate that was already spotless. He sought to avoid a scene, to deflect pity, to simply find a semblance of peace. But John remained, unyielding in his need to atone. He took a tentative step forward. "Daniel," he began softly, "I owe you an apology, not just for tonight, but for forgetting who I used to be." Daniel didn't look up, his voice measured. "It's fine, sir. You don't owe me anything. People forget. That's just how life is." His tone was calm, but his heart felt heavy, burdened by the countless empty apologies he'd witnessed, words that dissolved as quickly as they were uttered. But John stood his ground, his voice breaking with emotion. "No, it's not fine. You gave me food when I had nothing. You looked at me like I was still worth something. And tonight, I treated you like you were nothing." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's not who I want to be." Daniel finally met his gaze, their eyes locking in a moment of profound connection. Two men, seemingly from disparate worlds, bound together by a shared history, a forgotten act of kindness. "You know," Daniel said softly, his voice tinged with melancholy, "when I worked at that shelter, I used to think feeding people was just about providing sustenance, but it wasn't. It was about preserving their dignity. Everyone deserves to feel seen." John nodded slowly, swallowing hard, the weight of his transgression pressing down on him. "You're right," he conceded, his voice thick with shame. "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." He reached into his wallet and extracted a business card, sliding it across the counter. "I own a company now, real estate. If you ever want something better, call me." Not as an act of charity, but as a man offering another man an opportunity. Daniel glanced at the card, then back at John, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I'm okay where I am. I'm not waiting for a better life, sir. I'm building one." John's eyes shone with newfound respect. For the first time that night, he smiled, not with arrogance, but with genuine humility. "Then maybe," he said softly, "I should learn from you." And with those words, the man who had once mocked him turned and walked away, transformed by the simple act of remembrance. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the restaurant's expansive windows, casting golden rays across the polished floor. Daniel arrived early as always, tying his apron with quiet precision, bracing himself for the mundane routine. He held no expectations of change. People tended to forget quickly, especially in this world. But a lingering warmth remained in his chest, a faint echo of the previous night's storm, now calmed. Maria walked in behind him, a soft smile gracing her lips. "You made the whole restaurant go silent yesterday," she said, a hint of awe in her voice. "I've never seen anything like it." Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, sometimes silence can teach more than shouting ever could." Meanwhile, across the city, John sat in his executive office, his gaze fixed on the panoramic cityscape beyond the window. He had spent most of the night replaying Daniel's words, the simple yet profound statement echoing in his mind. You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human. Those words resonated with a depth that transcended any business triumph or financial setback. He recognized how far he had strayed from the man he once was, the man who had known the harsh realities of pain, hunger, and the humbling experience of relying on the kindness of strangers. Without divulging his plans to anyone, John made a phone call that afternoon to St. Mary's Shelter, the same sanctuary where he had once found hope and where Daniel had dedicated his time. "Do you still accept volunteers?" he inquired, his voice carrying a newfound humility. "Always." The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. That weekend, John arrived at the shelter, his sleeves rolled up, his hands ready to serve. He spent hours washing dishes, distributing food, and listening to the stories of people struggling to make ends meet, their experiences mirroring his own tumultuous past. Every face he encountered held a piece of his former self, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. And when one of the men, his curiosity piqued, asked, "Why is a guy like you doing this?" John responded with a gentle smile, "Because someone once fed me when I was hungry." Back at the restaurant, Daniel remained unaware of John's transformative journey. He only knew that something within him felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. He had faced humiliation with unwavering grace, emerging with his dignity intact. Sometimes, Daniel mused, you didn't need to engage in a battle to change people's hearts. You simply had to remind them of the inherent power of kindness. 2 weeks passed uneventfully. Life at the Blue Harbor restaurant resumed its familiar rhythm, the clinking of glasses, the soothing melodies of jazz, and the silent ballet of waiters navigating the tables, their movements precise and practiced. Daniel was attending to table 12 when the hostess approached him, her expression tinged with curiosity. "Daniel, someone has requested your presence," she said. "They mentioned it was important." He paused, wiping his hands on his apron, his brow furrowed in confusion. Standing near the entrance was John, no longer adorned in his customary expensive suit, but dressed in a simple, unassuming shirt and a worn jacket. He appeared different, his demeanor softened, his eyes radiating a newfound lightness, as if he had finally shed a heavy burden. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then cautiously approached him. "Good evening, sir," he said politely. John smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that reached his eyes. "Please, no more, sir. Today, just John." Daniel nodded slowly, acknowledging the shift in their dynamic. "All right, John. What brings you back?" John took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the bustling restaurant. "I wanted to thank you properly this time," he said, his voice sincere. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small brown envelope, extending it towards Daniel. "This isn't charity," he clarified. "It's a donation, made in your name, to St. Mary's Shelter. They mentioned you used to work there. I thought maybe we could help them feed a few more hungry souls." Daniel cautiously opened the envelope, revealing a check inside, an amount exceeding his annual earnings. A lump formed in his throat, rendering him speechless. "You didn't have to do this," he finally managed to say. "I did," John interjected gently, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You gave me back my humanity. I simply want to pay it forward." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the bustling restaurant fading into the background. Stripped of their titles and uniforms, they were simply two individuals, connected by a shared experience of pain and the transformative power of grace. Daniel offered a soft smile, his eyes reflecting his gratitude. "Then I guess we're both feeding people again," he said. John chuckled softly, his eyes sparkling with renewed purpose. "Yes," he replied. "Only this time it's not just about physical nourishment." And in that profound moment, forgiveness wasn't spoken. It was felt, a silent understanding passing between them, bridging the gap between their disparate worlds. A month later, the crisp Chicago wind carried the first whispers of winter, a reminder of the season that had brought John to his knees. Cold enough to sting, yet gentle enough to evoke memories of that pivotal night. Daniel stood outside St. Mary's shelter, clutching a box overflowing with canned goods, his contribution to the evening's meal. The sky glowed with the fiery hues of sunset, gradually fading into the deep indigo of the approaching night. Inside, the shelter buzzed with activity, a symphony of clinking bowls, cheerful chatter, and the aroma of hearty soup, a haven of warmth and camaraderie. It smelled of hope, second chances, and the unwavering belief in human kindness. Daniel placed the box on the counter when a familiar voice called out from behind, a playful note in its tone. "You still work too hard, don't you?" He turned to find John standing there, a volunteer apron tied around his waist, his sleeves rolled up, diligently handing out bread to the line of waiting individuals. He no longer carried the weight of arrogance, but rather a lightness of spirit, a sense of purpose that radiated from within. Daniel smiled, a genuine expression of warmth spreading across his face. "Didn't think you'd actually stick around," he teased gently. John laughed softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I told you," he replied. "I was learning from you." They worked side by side for hours, Daniel serving soup with a comforting smile, John distributing bread, their movements synchronized, their connection transcending mere words. Around them, faces illuminated with gratitude filled the room, individuals who had been rendered invisible by the indifference of the world, yet seen and valued within these walls. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, John turned to Daniel, his voice soft with emotion. "You know," he said quietly, "that night in the restaurant, I thought you had stripped away my pride, but now I realize you saved it." Daniel smiled, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the faces of those who were eating, some laughing, some praying, each a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. "We all stumble and fall, John," he said, his voice gentle and wise. "The only thing that truly matters is what we do when someone extends a hand to help us rise again." Outside, the city lights shimmered across the rain-slicked streets, casting a magical glow upon the scene. A homeless man, shivering in the cold, approached the shelter door, seeking refuge from the biting wind. Daniel stepped forward, offering him a steaming bowl of soup with a warm, welcoming smile. The man's eyes welled up with tears, a silent expression of gratitude. And just like that, the circle of kindness continued, unbroken, perpetuating itself through acts of compassion. As they watched the man eat, John whispered, his voice filled with reverence, "You fed me when I was hungry. Now you've fed my soul." Daniel turned to him, his expression serene. "That's all any of us can do, John," he said softly. "Feed each other when the world forgets." The night was quiet once more, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy with shame or regret. It was a silence filled with the quiet hum of humanity, a sacred stillness that spoke volumes. The end.